The Night Lords, once the 8th Legion of Space Marines, were forged during the first founding. However, they would ultimately betray the Emperor of Mankind during the Horus Heresy in the early 31st millennium, joining the ranks of the 9 traitor legions of Chaos Space Marines. Distinct from many of the other traitor legions, the Night Lords do not pledge their loyalty to any of the 4 major Chaos gods individually. Instead, they follow the creed of Chaos Undivided, leveraging the power of terror to subdue and demoralize their enemies long before the battle begins. The Night Lords' mastery lies in the art of terror, using fear as their primary weapon. Their favorite approach to warfare involves brutal, overwhelming force of a weaker opponent, with no consideration for mercy or subtlety. Theirs is a path of wanton destruction and bloodshed, where they relish in instilling dread and carnage. However, their violent reputation, while mindless now, had once been driven by a sense of purpose. 10 millennia ago, their Primarch, Konrad Curze, known as the Night Haunter, was motivated by an unwavering desire to punish the guilty and impose a brutal sense of absolute justice. He grew up in the lawless environment of Nostromo, a lightless world of industrial decay, where violence and crime reigned supreme. The planet's cities were overrun with an ad hoc version of anarchy, and they produced adamantium, a metal that served as their only valuable export. Curze, being a creature of the dark, survived in the depths of Nostromo's hive cities, fighting for survival amongst the vermin and filth of the sewers. Unlike many of the other Primarchs who were embraced by their homeworlds, Konrad Curze's upbringing was one of isolation and fear. Nostromo was a world devoid of hope or order, and its very nature shaped the dark future of the leader of the Night Lords. His formative years led Curze to resort to acts of savage justice, becoming a spectral figure who preyed upon the wicked and the corrupt. However, his initial pursuit of order was gradually twisted by dark forces who sought to corrupt him. As Curze fell deeper and deeper still into his madness, so too did his vision for the Night Lords. Now his gene sons carry on his legacy, not as enforcers of justice, but as agents of terror. Their lust for murder and the macabre reflects their twisted psyche, which they inherited from their Primarch, who in his final moments acknowledged the futility of his cause. What began as a quest to purge the guilty from the galaxy devolved into an endless cycle of bloodshed, devoid of meaning or any chance for redemption. The story of the Night Lords, the midnight-clad warriors who traded their pursuit for justice for an eternity of terror, is a rather disappointing one. Their tale, much like the galaxy they now haunt, is one of darkness and an eternal war waged in the name of a fallen Primarch who hated them with a burning passion. As many of the Primarchs, Konrad Curze matured rapidly, and the world he would grow up in was nothing short of horrific. The planet of Nostromo was a place steeped in fear, as its corrupt society was dominated by rampant murder and unchecked crime. The streets were shrouded in darkness, with no natural light to break through the gloom. Even the alleys were teeming with dangerous criminals. It was nothing short of an oppressive environment in which Curze would become something more than a mere savior. He would become a predator, targeting the worst of society's offenders. Konrad Curze would embark on a grim crusade of his own. He actively mutilated the remains of those he punished and displayed them publicly, sending a clear message to all those who lived there: fear the Night Haunter. The Night Haunter's reign of terror would soon extend far beyond the criminal underworld, affecting even those common citizens of Nostramo who strove to be good. In time, the fear Curze instilled was so great that all the inhabitants of the city, innocent and guilty alike, locked themselves away. His brutal campaign of vengeance brought about a form of false peace. Said peace was rooted entirely in dread. When the Emperor of Mankind finally found Curze, the Primarch himself had asserted dominance over the planet, ruling as Nostromo's Dark King. However, this was no reign of benevolence. Curze ruled through fear and fear alone, enforcing a grim order where even the smallest infractions were met with a gruesome death. The people believed that the Emperor's arrival marked the beginning of a new era, but when the Emperor took Curze away to Terra, Nostromo plunged back into its natural order, a state of anarchy, as no one remained to uphold the nightmarish peace that Curze had imposed. Curze's methods were unquestionably brutal, and seemed to have stemmed from a deeply rooted belief in absolute justice, albeit a justice twisted by the harsh reality of his upbringing. On Nostromo, Curze learned that only absolute dominance could suppress the chaos around him. Any sign of mercy or weakness would inevitably lead to betrayal. Even after joining his fellow Primarchs in the Emperor's Great Crusade, Curze adhered to these bleak principles. Unlike some of his brothers who fought for hope or unity, Curze saw only the darker truths of his existence, believing that fear and repression were the only effective tools for maintaining order. Curze's demeanor remained somber and introspective all throughout the Great Crusade, as he preferred solitude, avoiding camaraderie from his fellow Primarchs. Instead, he found comfort amongst the warriors of his own legion, the Night Lords. Under his guidance, the Night Lords became masters of fear driven by warfare, employing tactics designed to break the spirits of their enemies long before combat would actually begin. These methods were not merely violent, but they were calculated tactics designed to sow as much terror as possible, ensuring that resistance would seem futile. Even before the galaxy was engulfed in the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords had earned a rather negative reputation for their out-and-out cruelty. The worlds that they brought into compliance did not simply fall to the might of the Imperial forces sent. They were crushed utterly and left with such overwhelming destruction that any thought of rebellion would be extinguished. Where others saw brutality, Curze and his legions saw necessity, believing that crushing opposition in such a thorough and savage manner was the only way to maintain a long-lasting order, the irony of which would not be lost on the Legion later. In the end, the legacy of Konrad Curze and the Night Lords became one of fear, control, and merciless conquest, driven once again by Curze's own warped sense of right and wrong. The Night Lords' methods would come to shape the very identity of the Legion, turning them into instruments of terror for millennia to come. As the galaxy burned, they would stand forever apart as dark avatars, a vision of justice that had long since become indistinguishable from madness. Konrad Curze, like many of his rebellious siblings, ultimately crossed the threshold which there was no return from, long before he officially turned against the Emperor. His descent into darkness became increasingly clear following a physical altercation with Rogel Dorn, one of his loyalist brothers, just prior to the Horus Heresy. This act, compounded by Curze's erratic behavior, prompted his fellow Primarchs to convene a council to deliberate on his apparent mental instability. However, Curze preemptively escaped their judgment. On the world of Cherat, he slew his guards and fled from imperial custody, eventually returning to the one place that had shaped him so profoundly, his homeworld Nostromo. In the year 984 M30, Curze enacted his final and most devastating act of vengeance. Nostromo, once again consumed by the very corruption and lawlessness that he had tried to purge, became a target of his wrath, due to, in essence, proving the core of his principles as faulty. Leading his fleet of Night Lords, Curze ordered a concentrated bombardment on the planet, targeting a weak point in the crust that he had found long ago. This assault unleashed catastrophic devastation and reduced the world to merely space rubble and debris. In that moment, some say Curze not only damned Nostromo, but himself, ensuring his eternal fall from grace. When Horus the War Master would eventually declare his treachery and plunge the galaxy into civil war, Curze rapidly sought to join his ranks, as he embraced the conflict with a fervor that shocked even his allies, indulging in his most malevolent and twisted instincts. For the Night Haunter, it was never simply about defeating the enemy, as Curze taught his legion to make examples out of their adversaries, to obliterate entire cities, slaughter civilians, and leave gruesome displays of broken corpses to serve as warnings to any who might dare oppose them. This campaign of terror and brutality continued unabated, even after Horus's eventual defeat during the Siege of Terra. Interestingly, unlike many of his fellow Primarchs, Curze did not succumb to the temptations of chaos during the Horus Heresy, or even afterwards, while others were elevated to demonhood, receiving the dark blessings of the ruinous powers. Curze remained untouched by such transformations, as his fate was different. Rather than ascend, Curze met his end at the hands of an assassin, dispatched by the Caladius Temple. Many of Curze's decisions were informed by his gift. Throughout his life, Curze had been haunted by the psychic visions of a grim future, which were due to a distorted echo of the precognitive abilities possessed by the Emperor and his brother Sanguinius. These visions had tormented him, constantly showing him the worst possible outcomes for every event, and sometimes showing him gleaming possibilities of hope. However, the overwhelming negativity was what Curze decided to view as reality. It was through one of these visions that Curze foresaw his own death at the hands of an assassin. This prophecy would eventually come to pass when the Caladius assassin Emshen struck him down. In a final grim twist, Curze did not resist his fate, rather he welcomed it, as he believed that allowing Emshen to take his life was the only way he would achieve vindication by proving his fatalist beliefs true. To Curze, his death was a confirmation of his worldview, a world governed by hypocrisy and cruelty. His final act was not one of defiance, but of resignation. In his mind, the Imperium, with all its noble ideas, was built on the same ruthless methods he had been condemned for employing. His death at the hands of the Imperium's agents, therefore, proved the righteousness of his long-held belief that the Emperor's grand vision was no better than his own grim reality. This bitter conclusion, this ultimate validation of his worldview, echoed long after his death, as his gene sons, at least those who had survived the long war, would continue to wage their campaign of terror, bound by their father's legacy. They perpetuated the Night Lord's war of murder and fear, striking from the shadows against the Imperium who they had come to loathe. For them, as for Curze, the war against the Corpse Emperor would never truly end. It would be a war fought in the darkness, without hope or redemption, just as their Primarch had always believed. Despite his hatred of them, they followed his legacy much more closely than that of the other traitors. The genetic legacy of the Night Lords remains a rather curious anomaly in the history of the Space Marine Legions, especially when we consider the path they have taken since their fall from the Emperor's favor. Despite turning traitor during the Horus Heresy, the gene seed of the Night Lords shows an unexpected resilience, maintaining a surprising degree of purity, despite them constantly being in the midst of the corrupting influences of chaos. This stands in stark contrast to many of their fellow traitor legions, whose gene seed has often suffered from significant degradation as it is warped by the influences of chaos. Scholars have long suspected that this unusual ability might be attributed to the Night Lord's lack of direct devotion to any single chaos god. Unlike the followers of Khorne, Slaanesh, Nurgle, and Tzeentch, the Night Lords do not surrender themselves fully to the ruinous powers, which may have insulated their genetic makeup from the more extreme mutations experienced by other legions. However, while the gene seed of the Night Lords remains at its core stable, the genetic legacy of their Primarch, Konrad Curze, does manifest in certain unique ways. All the members of the Night Lords exhibit certain physical traits, as they possess jet black eyes capable of exceptional night vision and extremely pale skin. The source of these characteristics is hotly debated as to whether they stem directly from the gene seed or from the Nostromian heritage, which was rapidly integrated into the Legion during the days of the Great Crusade, and inversely could have melded into the very artifice of the gene seed itself. What is clear, however, is that these traits heighten the Night Lord's fearsome presence, leading them to an otherworldly appearance, perfectly suited for their preferred methods of warfare, which are rooted in striking terror within their enemies. One of the more curious aspects of Curze's genetic inheritance is the transfer of his precognitive abilities to his gene sons. Though rare, some Night Lords exhibit fleeting glimpses of the future, usually manifesting as subconscious insights or feelings of overwhelming foreboding. These moments are typically dark and unsettling, reflecting the pervasive pessimism and fatalist ideology of Curze's own being. In most cases, these precognitive abilities are rather minor, offering little but heightened paranoia, a trait that has become apparently rather synonymous with the Night Lord's very own identity. Yet in rare cases, the ability is more pronounced, manifesting in full-blown episodes that reveal intricate and detailed visions of the future. These episodes can often last hours and can be overwhelmingly painful to those afflicted. However, they do offer a rather powerful advantage on the battlefield. Certain warbands of the Night Lords have been able to use these visions to anticipate the movements of their enemies, choosing their next strikes with a precision that suggests they are already aware of what is to come. While such foresight would seem like a gift, Imperial scholars have long theorized that these visions, like those of Curze, often lead the Night Lords into a self-fulfilled prophecy of darker outcomes. It is believed that Curze's own psychic legacy, unlike that of Sanguinius, while being powerful, carries with it an inherent mental instability, a curse, if you will, passed down to his gene sons. This Night Hunter's curse, as it is known, has doomed many of the Legion's most gifted precognitives to a life of torment and tragic fatalism. Most infamous of these prognitive warriors is the Soul Hunter, often referred to as the Prophet amongst his warband. His ability to foresee the future with chilling accuracy made him both feared and revered throughout the Night Lord's ranks, serving as a stark reminder of the burden carried by their once living father. This connection to their gene sire, however twisted, continues to define the Night Lord's culture as a whole, driven by their largely driving their ongoing campaign of terror across the galaxy. In the end, the Night Lords remain a legion, not only bound by their shared descent from Curze, but by his brutal, fatalistic worldview, as regardless if there are other options, they will continue to wage their war of terror, ever driven by the prophetic glimpses of the worst possible future, ensuring that, much like their Primarch, they walk a path which cannot be returned from. During the tumultuous era of the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords would stand apart from their traitor brethren, not due to their devotion to chaos, but due to their disdain for both holy and unholy crusades alike. This legion, once the Emperor's loyal tool of terror, had no grand ideology, no singular belief to unify them, beyond their lust for domination and fear. Unlike the other traitor legions who would mostly pledge themselves to the dark gods, the Night Lords remained largely uninterested in the powers or boons of chaos, choosing instead to embrace bleak independence as their fractured warbands wandered the galaxy, not in the name of some higher cause, but driven by their own hunger for plunder, death, and the near genetic desire to instill terror into their enemies. This rejection of chaos, while not universal amongst them, was rather pervasive. Many Night Lords would shun the company of those who had become fanatics of the ruinous powers, preferring instead to maintain their own nihilistic code. Despite their fragmented nature, the Night Lords' method would remain consistently brutal. Terror was the closest thing to philosophy they believed in. Instilling fear was the ultimate goal of their existence, and it was often achieved before a single blow was struck. To this end, they adorned themselves with symbols of death, crafting their appearance to evoke dread. Their power armor, often heavily modified, would be covered in skulls, skeletons, lightning bolts, grotesque maw-like images, and even the flayed remains of their mortal enemies. For the Night Lords, victory was not simply about fighting their opponents, it was about dominating them psychologically. They used every weapon at their disposal, every tool, every tactic, regardless of how underhanded, to the point that they would even prize many of these more ornate and deadly weapons as trophies for their prowess and their ability to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. Their combat doctrine revolved around achieving psychological, strategic, and tactical supremacy long before they engaged in battle proper, to the point that if they cannot achieve this, they will often retreat. This was a legion that rarely fought fair, as infiltration, stealth, and deception were key elements in their combat style, in many ways resembling that of the Raven Guard. They would position themselves to ambush their enemies, often launching attacks after prolonged campaigns of psychological warfare, wearing down their opponent's will to fight before the final confrontation would take place. To the Night Lords, war was not a matter of honor or glory, but of achieving a swift and decisive victory by any means necessary. They would only engage in combat when assured of an easy victory, never out of bloodlust alone. Since the Horus Heresy, Imperial scholars have sought to understand how the once loyal legions Astartes could fall so deeply into betrayal and wickedness. While the motivations of other traitor legions may be traced to corruption or the lure of power offered by those known as the Chaos Gods, the Night Lords have always been an anomaly, created by the Emperor to bring terror to a lawless galaxy. Some wonder whether they were doomed from the start, or if their brutality was unnecessary evil within the Emperor's vision for a united humanity, or if it was a mistake on his behalf, a reflection of the darkest aspects of their gene-sire, Konrad Curze. These questions are without clear answers. Even when the Night Lords were counted amongst the loyalist Space Marine legions, there were always whispers and doubts, as some claimed that they were nothing more than monsters required to drag humanity into the light, while others believed that they were an outright miscalculation by the Emperor, a legion poisoned from the start by their Primarch's twisted worldview and relentless pursuit of fear-based control. Yet others suggested that perhaps they were fated to fall, born for a future that they would help create, but never truly be a part of. Ultimately, all such speculation is moot. Whatever they might have been or could have become, the Night Lords now are little more than creatures of horror, their history stained by atrocities and bloodshed uncountable, as they remain one of the most feared of all the traitor legions, not because of power, but by design. It is not redemption that they seek, nor glory, or even outright power. They exist for terror itself, striving to fulfill the grim legacy of the Primarch. An existence defined by darkness, violence, and a twisted sense of retribution. With the overview completed, let's focus more closely on the Night Lords' history. The 8th Legion, known as the Night Lords, was marked by bloodshed and brutality from their very inception. Born out of the darkest recesses of ancient Terra, their first recruits were not drawn from noble houses or highborn families, but from the condemned, those banished to the lightless prison sinks beneath the planet's surfaces. These vast caverns, filled with the crumbling ruins of millennia past, were the final destination for men and women who had broken the laws of their masters. Here, they were sentenced to live out the rest of their lives, forever severed from the sun and the free air above, existing only in fear and violent struggles for survival. In the lawless depths of the subterranean wastelands, only the most ruthless and cunning could hope to survive. It was a realm where life was cheap and death was always near, with blades deciding the fate of the unfortunate, as they were constantly fed by new arrivals from teeming hive cities above. These prison sinks became breeding grounds for madness, savagery, and unremitted murder. Yet amidst the careless bloodshed and terror, there existed another breed of prisoner. Born into the dark and raised amidst the endless violence, some children grew to adapt to this grim environment. These children, having survived beyond a solar decade, were whispered about in fearful tones by the prisoners themselves, as they moved silently, their skin pale as ash, and even the most hardened killers feared them and sought to avoid these night children at all costs, as they viewed them as creatures shaped by the shadows of their world, figures that would become more than just myth of the prison sinks. It was from these pale and silent beings that the Emperor of Mankind selected the first warriors of the 8th Legion. Unlike their future Astartes brothers in other legions, these warriors carried the mark of their grim origins, as it seemed the ashen skin and somber tones integrated with the gene seed, as they were reflections of the darkness from which they had once come. The gene seed of the 8th Legion was uniquely suited to these Terran-born recruits, enhancing their natural traits in ways that seemed disturbingly deliberate, as though the Emperor himself had crafted their very genetic inheritance with forsaken souls in mind. This gene seed, while granting them heightened abilities typical of astartes, also amplified their connection to the dark. Their pale skin, already an adaptation for the absence of light, became even more ghostly, and their ability to see in near total darkness surpassed that of any other legion, a gift that even the Space Wolves would be jealous of. This gift, however, was not without a price. Exposure to the light of sun and stars often burned their eyes, forcing them to rely on filters and flare buffers. Even though they now walked the surface above, the warriors of the Night Lords would be forever bound to the shadows, cursed to perceive the light through the lens of eternal night. This legion of misfits, born of the depths of Terra and forged in cruelty, would go on to carve a legacy of fear and terror across the galaxy. Their heritage was unmistakable. Creatures of the dark, molded by the brutal crucible of survival in a world where mercy was unknown. They were the Emperor's chosen instruments, and yet their fate, as many have come to realize, was to walk a dark path, shrouded in death and despair, fitting for those whose very existence began in the darkness. During the Unification Wars, the Emperor of Mankind's 8th Legion was called upon to carry out tasks that few others could stomach. "Send the 8th," the Emperor would reportedly say when hearing of the resurgence of the Crimson Walkers, who were a dire threat to the fledgling imperium. The 8th Legion, later known as the Night Lords, was deployed where more than just victory was required, when retribution and terror were needed to make an example. Their mission was not only to crush rebellion, but to root out the remnants of the old order, those who clung to the sins of the past and dared defy the new imperium. Many of these rebellions came from forces that had only submitted to the Emperor out of fear, believing him to be just another temporary warlord amidst the ashes of the techno-barbarian kingdoms that had dominated Old Night. In secret, these groups harbored forbidden practices, refusing to abandon their dark traditions of the past. The Sargon Enclave, for instance, continued to conduct grotesque gene experiments, while the cybreeding programs of the court of Antus openly violated the Emperor's decrees. Perhaps the most notorious was the March of 10 Million, an affront to the emerging imperium that required a swift and brutal response. It was these situations that the 8th Legion excelled in, showing no mercy and tolerating no ambiguity. Unlike other legions whose moral judgments might allow for nuance, the Night Lords viewed the world in stark, uncompromising terms. Light and dark, innocent and guilty, life and death. There was no room for forgiveness in their vision of justice, only the cold inevitability of retribution. For the 8th, the very concept of morality was indivisible. Once someone was marked as guilty, their fate was sealed. To dwell in the darkness was to forfeit one's right to mercy, and the only language the Night Lord spoke to such beings was the language of violence and bloodshed. In the name of absolute justice, the Night Lords operated with a singular purpose. To them, justice was not kind or merciful, but swift and unyielding, as cold as the steel of the blades they wielded. Their actions were often described as monstrous, but there was an unsettling clarity in their minds. They were a creation born from darkness, yet their war was fought for a future in which their kind might have no place, a future of light, where justice reigned and the shadows had no hold. The question, however, remains, was there nobility in the 8th Legion's actions? Did they truly fight for a better tomorrow? Or were they merely monsters unleashing terror because it was all they knew? Those who reflect on the early days of the Night Lords might find themselves drawn to a more romantic notion that these warriors born of cruelty were necessary evils, doing what others could not for a brighter future. Yet such an interpretation might be too kind. Perhaps, in truth, they were monsters, beings of pure horror, whose atrocities could not be justified by any higher purpose. As history recalls their deeds, one must wonder whether the moral absolution the Night Lords sought was ever real, or merely a justification for unleashing the terror they so relished in. The line between justice and horror, it seems, was as thin as the blades they wielded. The fate of the 8th Legion, the Night Lords, was perhaps sealed long before their Primarch, Konrad Curze, was reunited with them, as it was not merely Curze's arrival that cast a shadow of doom over the Legion, but rather the desolate wastes of Nostramo, the place where Curze was born, and from where his warriors would be derived. Nostromo was more than just the home of their Genestealer, but it was the crucible of corruption, misery, and darkness that fundamentally molded their legion and their descent into the monsters they would become, and their descent into treachery. To understand the true tragedy of the Night Lords, we must first understand Nostromo itself. This bleak, sunless hive world existed in perpetual twilight, its atmosphere thick with the pollution of industry. The planet, as it was, had been orbiting a dying star, one whose feeble light was unable to penetrate the toxic smog that constantly blanketed the surface. Even at high noon, the difference in illumination between day and night was barely perceivable. It was a world that was defined by the shadows, lit only by faint blue illuminating strips which existed in the homes of the wealthy. For the rest of the population, darkness was an omnipresent force, suffocating both physically and mentally, and impacting the morality of all those in the world. Nostromo's wealth came from the vast stems of adamantine ore, which fed the forges of distant worlds. But the riches extracted from its depths did not trickle down to its people. Instead, they were channeled into the hands of the corrupt elite who ruled the world's upmost levels. The planet was in essence divided into 5 massive hive cities, from Nostromo Prime to Nostromo Quintus, each functioning as a self-contained industrial powerhouse. These hive cities were clustered around the planet's narrow habitable zone, where gargantuan constructs of metal and stone with towering smokestacks disappeared into the smog-choked skies. The architecture of the hives themselves mirrored the decay of the world. Narrow alleys twisted between towering structures, crisscrossed by metal bridges. Factories, cathedrals, and the mansions of the elite loomed over the vast slums, their exteriors decorated with grotesque gargoyles that leered at the destitute masses below. Life in the lower levels was brutal and short, as the society of Nostromo was built on exploitation and violence. In these warrens of suffering, the law held no sway, and the only truth was the blade. It was from this world that the 8th Legion's recruits would be drawn from, and it was here that their Genestealer, Konrad Curze, was shaped into the figure that he would become. Nostromo's sky was further darkened by the orbit of its moon, Tenebor, which blocked what little light the dying star could provide. During its rare summers, the moon's orbit synchronized with that of Nostromo, casting the world into an ever deeper darkness, where the distinction between night and day was entirely lost. This environment of perpetual night became more than just a physical reality for the people of Nostromo. It became a psychological and moral one as well. The endless blackness of the sky bred crime, corruption, and despair, and in such conditions, any sense of hope was quickly crushed. The few who thrived did so through brutality and cunning. Those in power held their positions not through value or merit, but through exploitation and fear. The planet's elites resided in their towering spires, insulated from the suffering below, while the rest of the population toiled and fought in the filth and shadows. It was in this crucible of corruption that the man who Konrad Curze would be born. Abandoned and alone, he grew up in the alleyways and undercities of Nostromo, learning from an early age that only violence and terror could keep him alive. The darkness of his homeworld seeped into his very soul, shaping it in a way that would forever change how he saw the universe and his place within it. From Nostromo, Curze would inherit a bleak worldview, one in which justice was cold and unforgiving as the ever-present night which surrounded him. This world, more than any other, set the 8th Legion on its tragic path. For while the Emperor may have designed his sons with a grand purpose in mind, Nostromo had already shaped its chosen son into something darker. The world's legacy passed through Curze to his legion would define the Night Lords forevermore, as creatures of fear, judgment, and blood. As much as Curze's genetic heritage molded the Legion, it was the corrupting influence of Nostromo that truly set them on their path to become the terror they would be known for throughout the stars. The Night Lords were born in darkness, and in darkness was where they would remain. Smog hung heavily over Nostromo, a suffocating shroud which turned the faint glow of lamps and windows into sickly pale halos. The air itself was a toxic brew of dust and smoke, along with noxious chemicals which seeped into the very bodies of the planet's inhabitants, hastening their decline into servitude and misery evermore. Life on Nostromo was defined by slow erosion and the loss of hope, where the idea of happiness was a distant, unachievable dream for those who were unfortunately trapped in the hive cities. There was no brightness, only darkness and decay. The physiology of the people of Nostromo remained mostly similar to baseline humans from Segmentum Solar. Yet one haunting detail differed. No resident of Nostromo had irises. Their eyes, entirely pupil, reflected the planet's endless night. Their pale skin was gaunt, and their frames mirrored the harshness of the world. While their personalities were shaped by their environment, one which fostered distrust, callousness, and dark humor, this widespread albinism, though a rare mutation elsewhere, had become commonplace in Nostromo, in an odd way almost mirroring the darkening of the skin of the salamanders. In the endless depths of these cities, most of Nostromo's population lived in abject poverty. They toiled as foundry workers, grinding out a meager existence in the service of the wealthy elites who grew richer and richer still by exploiting the masses and eradicating any opposition. Violence was a constant companion to any of those who lived there. While mental illness and perpetual sorrow were inescapable parts of daily life on Nostromo, overpopulation, which was a frequent bane of hive worlds, was not curbed by law or disease here. Instead, it was self-termination that kept the populace in check, as most citizens would die young, coughing up black dust as their bodies succumbed to long blight or the chemicals that ate away at them from the inside. But these fates, as horrific as they may seem, paled in comparison to the alternatives of death by some of the most sadistic violence imaginable. Nostromo was a planet owned by darkness, body, soul, and spirit. The laws, if they ever truly existed, had long been erased by greed. Murder had become the cruelty of life, and power came only to those willing to kill for it. It was a place where every human sin, great and small, found its home in the eternal night. The remembrancers who documented Nostromo's history after its reclamation by the Imperium recorded that weeping and pleading were the constant sounds carried by the wind. Every child born on this thrice forsaken excuse of a world quickly learned that the only law was the law of the knife, and only the strong had the right to enforce their will. Criminal gangs held sway over every single corner of Nostromo, from the filthy slums to the palaces of the nobility. In the lowest districts, they ruled by sheer terror, torturing and killing as they pleased, waging bloody wars against the feral outcasts who roamed the alleys like wild animals. Many of these gangs were rumored to eat the bodies of the dead, treating their territories as if they were predators. Even within the hive city's mines and factories, the gangs dominated. They functioned, thinly veiled as it might be, as industrial overseers. They bore names that echoed false authority: Iron Overseers, Hands of the Corganado, the Sons of Tile. These slab-muscled enforcers, scarred from years in the furnace, walked the streets armed to the teeth, stinking of bloodshed as they enforced brutal order over those who were little more than slaves. In the upper levels, where the corrupt aristocracy lived in luxury, their children would form gangs of their own. Raquel's sons and the daughters who strutted about in flamboyant costumes, indulging in the same violent tendencies as the low-born gangs. For them, an insult was easily repaid in blood, as it was in words, and life held no more worth than a few moments of fleeting pleasure. These gangs of nobility, though dressed in the trappings of wealth and power, were no different from the cutthroats in the alleyways below. No matter their station, almost every gang on Nostromo swore fealty to one of the countless barons, counts, or lords who ruled the planet in name only. These powerful figures, many of whom adorned themselves with grand titles that echoed a long-forgotten nobility, were little more than the heads of vast criminal empires. There was no true distinction between the ruling elite and the lower-born gang leaders, as they were cut from the very same corrupt cloth. Together they reigned over a kingdom built upon violence, greed, and unrestrained sin. In the end, Nostromo was a world of horrors. It was a place where the lines between ruler and criminal, light and dark, had long since disappeared, leaving behind only the grim reality of survival in a world devoid of mercy or justice. This was a realm from which Konrad Curze had emerged, and this was the darkness that he carried into the 8th Legion. As much as the Emperor shaped his gene sons, it was Nostromo that left an indelible mark on the Night Lords. The story of Konrad Curze, Primarch of the 8th Legion, is a tale steeped in both horror and tragedy, and one which leads to inevitable doom. His first memories, if we are to believe the heretical chronicles known as the Dark, were of his arrival on Nostromo, the forsaken world that shaped his destiny. According to these accounts, Curze's journey from Terra was no ordinary one. His gestation capsule was violently thrown through the warp by the machination of the Chaos Gods, and, for the 8th time, the universe's worst mother. And his gestation pod was cast, like a fiery comet, into the very shrouded depths of Nostromo. His capsule did not merely land, as it tore through the dense urban sprawl of Nostromo Quintus, the largest hive city on the planet. The force of his arrival was so great that it breached the planet's very crust, burrowing deep into the geosphere, halting only near the molten, unstable core of the planet. The impact would go on to leave a permanent scar on the adamantine-laden crust, a wound that would be feared and whispered about by the planet's inhabitants for generations. Theories abound as to how Curze survived such a catastrophic entry, with some believing that he swam through the molten metal of the planet's mantle, while others claimed volcanic vents may have pushed him back to the surface. Whatever the truth, the manner of his arrival was as violent and unyielding as the life he would lead. Unlike many of his fellow Primarchs, who were discovered and raised by adoptive families, Curze found himself utterly alone in the depths of Nostromo's underhive. The world he was born into was one of relentless darkness and despair, and so too was the life he was forced to lead. In the feral depths of the lower levels of Nostromo Quintus, Curze survived through sheer willpower, hunting the mutated animals that prowled the hive's twisted alleys. His survival was not just a testament to his physical prowess, but also the terrifyingly sharp instincts he developed in the hostile environment. Yet even from his earliest days, Curze was haunted. Unlike his brothers, who were driven by grand ideals or heroic visions, Curze was tormented by precognitive nightmares, visions of dark, inevitable futures. These waking dreams were not fleeting or vague. They were vivid and horrific, impossible to escape even. They filled his fledgling mind with images of blood, death, and betrayal, portents of paths he would one day walk. These visions cursed him, shaping his worldview and driving him towards a grim philosophy of macabre fatalism that defined his rule and his legion. For Curze, the future was not a dream of possibility or hope. It could not be changed. It was a paranoid nightmare from which there was no escape. As Curze grew, so did his infamy. He would become a figure of dread, a specter, haunting the already darkened corridors of Nostromo. The underworld he had been born into was one ruled by violence and fear, and Curze was a master of both. His vision of justice was one absolute, shaped by prophetic nightmares and the brutal world around him. He did not seek admiration, only fear, the purest, most primal response. To him, fear was a truth, a force that stripped away any pretense and revealed the dark souls of humanity. In his eyes, the darkness of Nostramo was not just physical, it was spiritual, and it reflected the rot at the heart of humanity's very soul. Curze embodied and embraced this darkness, and in doing so, he became its ruler. Uniquely amongst the Primarchs, Konrad Curze grew up utterly alone and untouched by the guiding hand of any human parent or mentor. Abandoned in the underhives of Nostromo Quintus, in essence, his wit and unyielding resolve would be all that kept him alive. His environment, a world of ceaseless darkness, suffering and corruption became a crucible. Curze's genetically enhanced body and mind, designed by the God Emperor, gave him an unparalleled amount of strength, speed, and cunning, which he used to establish dominance in the lawless hive cities of Nostromo. Through sheer force of terror, Curze imposed a brutal sense of order on the violent and corrupt society around him. The criminal gangs and the corrupt nobles that had once ruled with impunity became the targets of his horrific justice. He became a dark arbiter of retribution, and in doing so, he began to shape Nostroman society in his own image, but he never attempted to change them in any long-lasting way. What started in the decaying streets of Nostramo Quintus soon spread to the planet's other hive cities. This once ungovernable hive world trembled under the shadow of Curze's reign. Within a single standard year of his rise, the crime rate across Nostromo plummeted to near zero. The population, accustomed to the chaotic lawlessness that had reigned for generations, now lived in paralyzing fear. Entire cities became still as Curze's reign of terror expanded. The streets of Nostramo Quintus, once teeming with life, even in the dead of night, became deserted husks after dark. No one dared walk the streets after sunset, for what little that light was worth. A self-imposed curfew took root upon the planet. Shops closed early, and the once bustling alleyways fell into an eerie silence. It wasn't long before Curze's reign of terror earned him a new moniker, that of the Night Haunter, a title that spread like wildfire. Whispered in hushed voices by the terrorized citizens, mothers began to discipline their children with threats of the Night Haunter, a faceless specter that would roam the streets, seeking out the wicked to punish in the most grotesque ways imaginable. The image of a dark figure with filthy claws, always ready to disembowel those who defied his law, became etched into the very psyche of the people. As rumors of his atrocities grew, so did Curze's legend. The very mention of the Night Haunter's name could send ripples of fear through Nostroman hive cities, as his reign was not one of admiration and respect, but one of pure, unrelenting dread. The terror that he invoked was physically palpable, casting shadows over the entire planet, as the populace of Nostromo would now live in a constant state of fear, silence, and compliance, knowing that even a whisper of dissent could bring down the Night Haunter's wrath upon them. With the populace cowed, Curze's iron grip upon the hive cities tightened. What was once chaotic and lawless was now bent to his will. But the cost of this pervasive atmosphere of terror? It seems Nostromo had not been saved, but rather it had been enslaved by fear, made ripe for the rule of the Night Haunter. Curze's dark justice reigned supreme. Through an unrelenting campaign of brutality, Curze eventually ascended to become the undisputed ruler of both his home hive city, Nostramo Quintus, and soon after the entire planet of Nostromo. During this reign, he earned the Night Haunter title, synonymous primarily with the brutal murder of hundreds, if not thousands, of Nostromo's criminals and corrupt aristocrats. Later, in the era of the Horus Heresy, Curze would quickly reclaim this title, as he descended into the service of chaos. As the self-declared Dark King of Nostromo, Curze embraced his new role with an insatiable thirst for knowledge, absorbing all available information with a diligence bordering on obsession which could outpace Magnus's own. He ruled with a paradoxical mix of temperance and savagery. His leadership, when uninterrupted by injustice, was marked by reason and moderation. Yet when tales of corruption or wrongdoing would reach his ears, his response was rather swift and terrifying. Curze would personally hunt down the guilty through the hive city's labyrinthian streets, driving them to exhaustion before delivering the final gruesome punishment, mutilation, but never beyond recognition. It was a fate known to every citizen and to all those who knew the individual hunted down, one that fostered a deep-seated dread across the planet. This chilling blend of calculated wisdom and unspeakable violence shocked Nostroman society into submission rather than any real change. Under the watchful eye of the Night Haunter, the populace shifted towards a strange, fearful equilibrium. For the first time, honesty and efficiency became the cornerstones of their lives. Crime dwindled to nothing, while the planet's exports of adamantium a resource which was valued by every neighboring world, would drastically skyrocket. The transformation was rather remarkable. Once shrouded in darkness and corruption, Nostromo's Quintus became a city of light and prosperity, driven by shared wealth and terror. The rest of Nostromo would soon follow the example set by its capital. The Night Hunter's influence would spread like a shadow across the entire planet, and every last one of its hive cities adopted his harsh and effective order. Fear of attracting Curze's attention kept the people in line, ensuring that the horrors that befell those in Quintus never reached their own homes. Curze's reign effectively eradicated Nostromo's long-standing culture of crime and predation for now, as he dismantled the planet's criminal syndicates and eliminated the corrupt hierarchy that had ruled for centuries, replacing them with his own brand of draconian justice. The people revered him, not as a tyrant, but as an effective leader and a monster who had restored order where none had existed before. Curze's tactics and his instinctual use of stealth, his ability to strike without warning, and his unparalleled mastery of psychological warfare were characteristics that would later define the 8th Legion of Space Marines, who would become known as the Night Lords. Even before the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords had already begun decorating their armor with macabre symbols of death, understanding as their Primarch did that fear could be wielded as a weapon, as potent as any bolter or chainsword. Thus, under Curze's reign, Nostromo would be reshaped and molded by fear, ruled by a man whose justice was as cold and dark as the eternal night that enshrouded his home. Nearly a century after the Great Crusade had begun, the Emperor of Mankind finally set his sights on Nostromo. The year was 896 M30, and Nostromo's fate, long prophesied, was sealed by the Emperor's arrival. According to ancient Nostroman legends, the coming of this radiant figure would herald the planet's ultimate downfall. The Emperor descended upon Nostromo, and said descent was unlike anything its people had ever seen. His presence brought the sunlight into their eternally darkened world for the first time in memory. As his fleet touched down, the Emperor himself, accompanied by an imperial delegation, walked in the rain-slicked streets of Nostromo Quintus, the capital city. The citizenry, accustomed to living under the cloak of perpetual night, recoiled at the brilliance of his light. It is said that the radiance he emanated reflected so powerfully from the wet streets that those who dared gaze upon it were blinded. Most could only weep, unable to bear the sheer intensity of his presence. At the heart of the city stood the royal palace of the Night Hunter. It was there, at the end of the avenue, that Curze awaited the Emperor's approach. As the delegation neared, Curze was suddenly overwhelmed by a psychic vision, an inescapable glimpse of the terrifying future. The vision so vividly horrifying that the Night Hunter, in an attempt to rid himself of these images, tried to tear his own eyes out. However, before he could succeed, the Emperor intervened. At that moment, their fates intertwined, as the Emperor, with a voice as commanding as it was calm, addressed Curze directly. "Be at peace, Konrad Curze. I have arrived and I intend to take you home." Curze's response was a chilling testament to the weight of the destiny that he had long borne. "That is not my name, father. My people gave me a name, and I will bear it until my dying day, and I know full well what you intend for me." Curze's words revealed the depth of his foresight and his intimate knowledge for the path that lay before him. He submitted to the Emperor's will, not out of newfound loyalty, but as if resigning to an inevitable role in a tragedy he had long foreseen. In that instant, the fate of Curze and the 8th Legion, the Night Lords, was sealed. The path before them was dark, leading inevitably towards corruption and damnation. This pivotal moment, the meeting between the Emperor and the Night Hunter, set Nostramo on a course from which there was no return. The Emperor's light, though blinding in its brilliance, could not reach the darkest corners of Curze's soul, and the vision of the future that had haunted Curze since his youth would soon manifest, shaping not only the destiny of his legion, but casting a long shadow over the Imperium's future. Thus, the fall of Nostromo and the tragedy of Konrad Curze began to unfold in earnest, a dark chapter in the history of the Great Crusade that would reverberate throughout the ages.